The night shift at the small military hospital had always been quiet, almost too quiet for a place sitting only a few miles from an active conflict zone. The fluorescent lights hummed softly in the hallways while a handful of nurses moved between rooms checking on wounded soldiers who had been transported earlier that day. Outside, the desert wind brushed against the walls of the building, carrying the distant echo of helicopters and armored vehicles patrolling the region. Most of the staff had grown used to the tension that lived in the air around the base. Every day, soldiers arrived with injuries from patrols, training accidents, or the occasional firefight beyond the perimeter. Still, compared to the chaos outside the wire, the hospital felt like a calm island. In one of the quieter corridors stood a nurse named Emily Carter. She wore the same pale blue medical scrubs as everyone else, her dark hair tied back neatly as she studied a patient chart at the nurse's station. To anyone watching, she looked exactly like what she was supposed to be, a calm, focused nurse doing her job. A young Marine sitting nearby watched her for a moment before speaking. "You're new here, right?" he asked. Emily looked up and smiled politely. "Just transferred last week." The Marine nodded slowly. "Lucky you. This place is usually slow." Emily closed the chart. "I like slow." Across the room, another nurse laughed quietly. "Everyone says that until something happens." Emily simply returned to her work, moving down the hallway to check another patient. Inside room 12, a wounded army sergeant lay resting after surgery. His shoulder was heavily bandaged, but he managed a tired smile when Emily walked in. "How's the pain?" she asked. "Better, thanks to you." She checked his IV line and adjusted the monitor beside the bed. "You should get some sleep." The sergeant closed his eyes again. Outside the hospital, the night seemed peaceful. But only a mile away, a black pickup truck sped across the desert road with its headlights off. Inside the vehicle sat 4 heavily armed men dressed in mismatched tactical gear. Their faces were hard and focused as they approached the base perimeter. Their leader was a tall man with a scar running across his cheek. He was a former commando from a hostile militia group that had been operating in the region for months. His name was Rashid. And tonight he had one objective: inside the hospital building. The truck stopped behind a cluster of abandoned supply containers not far from the hospital's side entrance. Rashid stepped out first, checking his rifle. "Move quickly," he told his men. They slipped through a gap in the outer fence that had been quietly cut earlier that evening by another operative. Within seconds, the armed men were moving through the darkness toward the hospital. Inside the building, Emily was walking down the hallway carrying a tray of medical supplies when the power suddenly flickered. The hallway lights dimmed for half a second, then returned. Emily paused. Something felt wrong. Across the nurse's station, the older nurse looked up. "You see that?" Emily nodded slightly. Before either of them could say another word, a loud crash exploded from the main entrance. The glass doors shattered inward. Gunfire erupted instantly. Screams echoed through the hospital as patients and staff dove for cover. The armed men stormed into the lobby with rifles raised. "Everyone on the ground!" Rashid shouted. Panic spread through the building as nurses dropped behind desks and soldiers in hospital beds struggled to move. Inside the hallway, Emily helped push a stretcher into a storage room where several patients could hide. The older nurse looked at her nervously. "They're going to kill us." Emily's expression hardened slightly. "Stay here." She stepped back into the hallway alone. The sounds of shouting and boots hitting the floor grew louder as the attackers spread through the building. In the lobby, Rashid scanned the room carefully. He had expected guards, but the hospital security team had been pulled earlier that evening to escort a convoy leaving the base. This place was nearly defenseless. Just doctors, nurses, and wounded soldiers. Exactly what he wanted. "Find the officers," he ordered. One of his men nodded and moved down another hallway. Back near the nurse's station, Emily opened a small supply cabinet. Inside were basic medical tools, bandages, gloves, and behind them, something else, a locked metal box. She removed a small key from around her neck and unlocked it. Inside was a compact rifle and 2 magazines. Emily stared at the weapon for a moment. Her reflection looked back at her from the polished metal surface. The calm nurse was gone. In her place stood someone very different. She picked up the rifle. Down the hallway, 2 armed men approached cautiously. One of them kicked open a door and aimed his weapon inside. Clear. They continued forward. Then a single sharp shot echoed through the corridor. The first attacker dropped instantly. The second man spun around in shock. Another shot rang out. He collapsed beside his partner. Silence returned to the hallway. In the lobby, Rashid heard the gunfire. His head snapped toward the corridor. Who fired? One of his men checked the radio. No report. Rashid frowned. Move. They rushed toward the sound. As they reached the hallway, they saw the bodies on the floor. Rashid crouched beside one of them. A perfect bullet wound. Clean. Precise. Not the work of a frightened nurse. He stood slowly. Someone here knows how to fight. Further down the hallway, Emily moved silently between doorways, rifle raised. Her footsteps were controlled and quiet as she checked each corner. Her breathing was steady, her eyes focused. This wasn't panic. This was training. Years of it. In another hallway, one of the attackers grabbed a nurse and dragged her into the open. "Where are the soldiers?" he demanded. The nurse cried in fear. Suddenly, a voice spoke from behind him. "Let her go." He turned. Emily stood at the end of the corridor, the rifle aimed directly at his chest. The attacker laughed slightly. "A nurse with a gun?" Emily's finger tightened on the trigger. Last chance. He raised his weapon. 2 shots fired almost at the same moment, but only one found its mark. The attacker collapsed. The nurse fell to her knees, shaking. Emily walked toward her and helped her up. "Get to the storage room." The nurse nodded and ran. Moments later, Rashid entered the hallway with his remaining fighter. They stepped carefully over the bodies of their fallen men. Rashid's eyes narrowed. "Whoever you are," he called out, "you're making a mistake." Emily stepped into view. The fluorescent lights illuminated her calm face. Still wearing her nurse uniform, still holding the rifle with absolute confidence. Rashid studied her carefully. "You're not hospital staff." Emily didn't respond. "You're military." She finally spoke. "You picked the wrong building." Rashid smiled coldly. "I don't think so." He raised his rifle. But before he could fire, Emily moved. Her rifle cracked twice. Rashid's partner fell instantly. Rashid dove behind a doorway, bullets striking the wall where he had stood. For several seconds, neither moved. The hallway filled with silence again. Then Rashid laughed quietly. "A nurse who shoots like that." He stepped partially into view again. "You must be special forces." Emily's eyes never left the doorway. "You could say that." Rashid tilted his head slightly. "Navy?" Emily said nothing, but the small patch barely visible beneath her sleeve told the truth. A symbol known only to the most elite warriors. Rashid finally understood. His smile disappeared. "You're a SEAL." Emily answered calmly. "Yes." The hallway became completely still. For the first time since entering the hospital, Rashid realized the mission had changed. He had expected helpless staff and wounded soldiers. Instead, he had walked into a building protected by one of the most dangerous operators in the world. Emily's voice remained steady. "You're done." Rashid lowered his weapon. Outside the hospital, distant sirens began approaching as base security forces rushed toward the building. He looked at the fallen bodies around him, then back at Emily. "A nurse," he muttered quietly.
Emily adjusted her grip on the rifle. Not tonight. Minutes later, soldiers stormed the hospital and secured the building. They found Emily standing calmly in the hallway beside the captured attacker. One of the Marines looked around at the scene in disbelief. "You did this?" Emily set the rifle down. "I protected my patients." The Marine noticed the small patch on her sleeve. His eyes widened instantly. He straightened in respect. "Yes, ma'am." Down the corridor, nurses slowly emerged from hiding, staring at the quiet woman who had just saved their lives. To them, she was still Nurse Emily Carter. But the soldiers arriving at the scene knew something different. The hospital hadn't been defended by a nurse. It had been defended by a Navy SEAL.